Hello everyone, welcome to the first of our scenario reviews, and why not start with the tutorial to the game that is The Gathering. And this is kind of a strange scenario because it is the tutorial, so we do have to review it as the scenario that it is and not necessarily as a full-blown scenario like the other scenarios of either the core set or the other campaigns. That said, there's a lot going on in this tutorial in The Gathering and a lot of interesting moments and really cool things to talk about. So we also want to give it its fair due. It is the first one, and it's actually a great scenario, I think.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and start by talking sort of about what happens in this scenario. So we start in the study, and it's the only location in play. At first, it's pretty simple. You just have to get the clues in the study in order to progress the act and move on to the rest of the scenario. And it's a nice way to keep you from doing anything else, right? You're not trying to move around and explore. You are just taught get clues, kind of the most important thing in the game, right? And some things can spawn if you take too long, but it should be a fairly quick first act.
Yeah. It's a very nice introduction to the mechanics of the game. You have to investigate to get the clues and move on. So that involves taking actions as well as making skill tests. And so it introduces those core concepts before you get into other things like movement and enemies.
The only thing that's a little strange, although I don't think they could have done much about this, is that when you do end up drawing encounter cards, and we'll get to this in a second, you have a possibility of drawing encounter cards that can't spawn. But once you get the other locations into play, which happens pretty quickly, those cards can pop up no problem. All right, so what
Yeah.
happens next?
Yeah. So then we transition into the main location setup. You're dropped in the hallway, which has no clues, which means that you are forced to move, which is a nice way to tutorialize moving as an action. And you go either to the attic or the cellar. Um, they both have the clues you need to advance, as well as I do very much like how the flavor text on the attic and the cellar hint at what might occur when you enter those locations. I think that's a really nice, cool piece of flavor there.
Yeah, I agree. And let's take a
Uh,
look at what those are.
yeah,
So the attic, you take a horror, and that gives you a nice way to think about what might happen. Bad things can happen when you move into locations, so you don't do that willy-nilly. But it also gives you two opportunities to think about victory points.
absolutely. You'll notice that the total amount of clues on both the attic and the cellar is more clues than you need to advance this second act, which only requires three per investigator clues instead of the total of four. And so it leads to an interesting amount of decision making when it becomes do we only get the clues that we need, or do we get more clues to try and get the victory that we'd want to spend XP on?
Mm-hmm. All right, and then in short order, we move on to the next act, which is kind of the moment in this scenario that everyone's going to remember.
Absolutely. Ghoul Priest comes out and he's absolutely huge, especially for the players just starting out and indeed just in the core set. Five per investigator health seems very much like a tall order.
And for combat, retaliate, all that damage and horror that it deals, I mean, it's very, very scary even today for other scenarios. But there is one way to get around this that makes it a lot easier, and you are told to probably go talk to Lita Chandler.
Yeah, I think that the way that the Ghoul Priest is structured is that when he spawns in the hallway,
Mm-hmm.
which actually does invoke the prey keyword because if there are multiple investigators here, he will attach to his prey. And therefore, most likely in the core set, that would be Roland Banks, or in fact, anyone. It'll probably be your main fighter. So it works out that the Ghoul Priest is engaged with your fighter, while someone like a Seeker with high intellect would move to the parlor, get Lita Chandler, and then potentially move back to the hallway to help the other investigators. So I think there's a key piece of design there when it comes to who who the responsibility of each investigator in this last half, where it's just a kill boss or resign objective.
Yeah, that's right. And even if you have someone to evade, that isn't a bad idea either. So
Yes.
your five core investigators, you've got Roland, Daisy, uh, Agnes, Skids, and Wendy. They all kind of can do something here, right? Either they're going to be fighting or pinging some damage, or they can maybe evade and run over to pick up Lita. So that's actually pretty nice introduction to the multiple types of tasks you'll be asked to do. But man, he's still scary, right?
He's really scary. Like level 0 investigators on 2-player, that's 10 health, which doesn't seem like a lot. But honestly, in 4-player, when we started, this was a 20 health enemy, which
Wow.
seems unsurmountable.
Okay, so that's it. Then you defeat him or you run away.
Yes. And then there's a little final choice in the resolution of the scenario, which always comes down to whether or not you're going to burn your house down,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually on the back of the act. That's right.
That's right. It's here.
And this is a really cool choice. It's mostly just flavor, mostly in the sense that it does affect the next scenario. There's a new location that occurs or that is in play, whether or not you burn your house down. But it also introduces the concept of trauma, since you'll take a mental trauma if you burn your house down. And it also investigates it also introduces the story asset, where you can gain story assets like Lita Chandler from decisions you make in throughout the course of a campaign. And Lita Chandler is huge, right? Her ability in this campaign specifically is fantastic. Not only because she just helped you against the Ghoul Priest, but because a lot of for example, Night Gaunts in the next scenario are monsters, and all of the agents of encounter sets in the third scenario are all monsters. And so she helps a lot. So making this choice of burning your house down or not is a classic sort of how much are you going to risk to obtain very good allies.
Yeah, she's got to be the best story asset still in the game, right?
Absolutely.
All right, so that's basically the scenario. And I think now we can take a look at some of the encounter cards that are introduced here, because they do have a lot of interplay with some of the things we just looked at. I'm thinking particularly of the Striking Fear encounter set to kind of start with.
Absolutely. So the Striking Fear encounter set is these cards. It's very weird. So these cards, sorry, not those cards.
Mm-hmm.
Those are ghouls. So yeah, these cards serve a very interesting function in this scenario. One, they're very thematic because this is introduced as a very fearful scenario. And so it makes sense for a Striking Fear to be in this scenario. And these encounter cards kind of touch on basically most aspects of what you're going to be doing in the game. You're going to be taking actions to move, fight, or evade, especially against encounter cards. You're going to be playing cards, either assets or events. And you're going to be making tests, notably willpower tests. And you can see that is what's most represented on the cards in this set. So this encounter set kind of lays the foundation for a lot of the encounter cards that all players will see in future scenarios.
And even just these cards, they pop up, I think, in almost every campaign, if not every campaign.
Absolutely.
So you've got to be prepared for this set. Roland Banks in particular is going to have a problem with with Rotting Remains and maybe with Frozen in Fear. He only has 3 willpower, and you're likely going to take some horror from cards like this, especially if you drop more than once, leaving you with a 5 sanity investigator with very little left. So you got to think about that. And in combination with, say, the Ghoul Priest, who does 2 horror on Retaliate, so if you fail a test or if he's just still around in the enemy phase, you're going to be in a lot of trouble at the end of this scenario. So there are ways around this. You can get some help from other investigators, in particular. Wendy coming with Roland as the recommended duo to start might evade the Ghoul Priest, so you don't take the horror on a failed attack. But even just something like Lita Chandler for extra soak, and there's a good lesson to having cards that will allow you to survive more than just, totally falling over from Rotting Remains a few times.
I also think that a key lesson in this encounter set, specifically with the card Dissonant Voices, is that cards should be committed to skill tests. Dissonant Voices does not affect an investigator's ability to commit cards, and specifically, the effects that a good skill card would have. And you can see here that since willpower is such a defensive stat, I think this goes to what the design is trying to say, which is commit cards to skill tests to try and pass tests. Like, don't worry about having cards that you can't even play if you get something like Dissonant Voices. Like, use those cards. Take Guts, take Unexpected Courage. Those cards will really help you out against these skill tests.
Yeah, and there's even other ways to work around Dissonant Voices, like you say, committing isn't playing, but also discarding, right? Sort of Wendy's ability. If you can't play Lucky, maybe redrawing a token is kind of like Lucky.
Yep.
All right, cool. It's an iconic set. It's, like I said, it's in almost every campaign, so you're learning something about the game in this introductory scenario that will help in every future one. All right, what's next? Let's probably talk about kind of its analog with Grasping Hands and the Ghouls.
Let's do it. So Grasping Hands and the Ghoul. Honestly, a little bit underused of an encounter set. There's only a few that they're used. The ghouls have this strange thing where the ghouls they appear in scenarios in very weird forms. Like, there's scenarios in Dream Eaters, and there's two in Dream Eaters that they appear in. And then there's that one in Carcosa, that they all kind of are what I would consider baseline enemies. Literally, it's just a 2/2 with 2 health. And then this guy's literally just a 3/3 with 3 health. That prey instruction on Ravenous Ghoul very rarely comes into play. So it's just a 3/3 with 3. And so what this encounter set does is it just introduces the mechanics of enemies without any text on them. And I think that's a really key sort of insight, which is, like, you have to learn how to deal with enemies before you have to, like, read the text on enemies and figure out what their deal is and stuff like that. So this is a good introductory set.
And of course, after this set, they really can't print any enemies that don't have text on it.
Right.
Look how many lines of the flavor text they have for the Ghoul minion. Like, that's never going to happen again.
I also love that it references the other use that they have in that Dream Eater scenario. Since
that's right.
That is the quote.
And I think they're in one scenario of the Scarlet Keys.
That's probably true. I can't remember, but I think you're right.
All right, I won't say anything more about that. All right, Grasping Hands, though, comes with this set, and unfortunately, I think because it's paired with the Ghouls, you don't see it very often, because it really is just Rotting Remains, but for damage, testing, agility. And early on, there weren't so many agility tests. This kind of maybe is the reason they couldn't figure out how to get Grasping Hands out of the Ghouls set. But yeah, it's kind of just the other side of Rotting Remains. It's still a good card. I think they've tried to reprint it with other effects. Maybe just if you fail a test, you take 2 damage rather than for each point you fail by. But especially in the first few campaigns after this one, you don't get too many of this kind of effect for damage.
Yeah, a lot of the damage cards either have a direct analog in the encounter set or an adjacent counter set in the campaign, or are strangely not testing foot. Like, some of the damage cards also test willpower, which is a little weird, but it is unfortunate, as you said, that Grasping Hands is kind of stuck with the Ghouls, because you're right, it is truly the Rotting Remains analog. And you can see that actually even Rotting Remains itself had some issues with being stuck inside Striking Fear. For example, there's that scenario in Circle and Done where they had to... No, yeah, that's right. They had to reprint some of the cards in Striking Fear other than Rotting Remains so that it still fit with the theme of what was going on.
Yeah, I think that happened in Carcosa as well.
Yeah.
So the other part to maybe point out, just sort of talking very vaguely about encounter cards, is the theme of them. So does Rotting Remains, like, I think we've talked about this ourselves. The art is often how I recognize cards, not necessarily by their title. And that's just kind of a iconic, that foot coming from underneath the sheet. It's just, that kind of sticks in my brain a little bit, along with all the blood. But I actually love the art in Grasping Hands, and it makes a little bit more sense. I mean, damage is maybe easier to understand than horror itself. But why are you taking damage and why are you doing an agility test? Well, because these hands are, grasping at you, right? You're trying to avoid getting clawed at or something.
Yeah, it's very successful in its minimalism, and yet it evokes so much from the art just itself. So it's good.
All right, cool. Let's go on to the other ghouls that are in this set and all the other enemies, perhaps. So
Yes.
these two ghouls are from this scenario and this scenario only.
Correct.
As I
And
mentioned
yeah,
before, they spawn in a particular location, and they don't have Hunter, which I think is true of the other ghouls. Maybe the Ravenous Ghoul has Hunter.
no, it does. They
No.
do not.
Okay. So the only hunters are the rats, that we'll get to in a second, and the ghoul priest. All right, so these guys just sit here until you feel like going into the attic or the cellar, but they are actually pretty tough enemies for the first scenario.
Especially, yes, absolutely. 4 health is nothing to scoff at level 0. Um, Especially in true solo, 4 health is kind of the threshold in which you think you could kill something in one round. Um, Especially if it spawns at a location that you're not at. Luckily, they don't have Hunter, so if they had Hunter and they spawned like a location away, that would be very much more difficult. Um, but otherwise, they're relatively balanced for the reward. They do have victory.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also think that the Flesh Eater is a lot easier to deal with than the Icy Ghoul, specifically because of that one evade. If you have 2 players, one investigator could go and evade it, while the other investigator takes its time to defeat it.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, there's honestly not much to say about them, other than it does introduce the spawn keyword, obviously, which is a good thing to talk about. Albeit, as you talked about earlier, in a little bit of an awkward way if you drew them during the study only portion.
Yep.
I'm trying to think of a way that they could have solved it. Obviously, they did quote unquote solve it in the return to by having them actually put their location that they spawn in play. Also, it's a little bit of a hack to fix it up, but
Yeah, I'm glad that they
yeah.
didn't do that in the vanilla version, just because it might be kind of confusing as far as like connections of
Yeah.
locations and whatnot.
That being said, I've also seen a lot of confusion on what happens now when I drew this enemy and it and nothing like it's kind of unintuitive that you would be like, oh yeah, just discard it and you're fine. Rather, like some people are like, oh, maybe it should like gain surge, or maybe it should do other things.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
incidentally, there are no cards in this encounter deck that have surge. So maybe they were trying to avoid having surge in this encounter deck just to start with. But
Yeah, good point. All right, that's enough for them. They are good victory points, and you can get a fairly sizable total from this scenario, right? You've got the 2 locations, you have the 2 enemies here, and then the 2 on the Ghoul Priest. So that's 6, and then maybe something from the resolution.
correct. If you get the resolution, as long as you, I think, don't die. Yeah, as long as you don't have your house burned down. Oh, sorry, not house burned down. As long as you don't, I believe this resolution 3 is like extremely rare, but it has to do with, um, actually, I don't know. How does that even occur? I think it has to do with the end of the agenda. Is that right?
Could
Yeah.
be.
So if they're not in Act 3 and they're like stuck in their house, then that happens.
Mm.
Anyway, um, if that doesn't occur, everyone's going to get 2 bonus experience. And the lead investigator has the possibility of earning another experience. So there's a lot of XP to divvy out. It's really good.
Yeah, wow. Wish that all of the intro scenarios had that. Maybe
Yeah.
that's something else we can talk about. Oh, one other thing we didn't talk about, which we definitely should, is the scenario reference card.
Yes.
Maybe this isn't the time for it, but I just remembered and I'll forget later. It's pretty simple too, because you only have these tokens in the bag. You're not going to get the other thing until later. So, yeah, the only thing that I would say that is maybe unintuitive that even experienced players will miss is that tablet. You'll get a damage even if you succeed.
Yep. It's definitely something that this game has done less and less now, especially on the easy/standard side of the scenario reference card. Notably, more often than not, if a negative effect would occur on the easy slash standard, it would be tied to failure. This is a case where it isn't.
Yep. Otherwise, the skull is almost always a 0.
Yeah.
And it probably unless you get to the end where the ghouls that you've left around start moving towards the hallway. I think that's what happens, right?
Correct. Yeah, the third agenda, they start moving, and the more of them in the hallway, the more Doom gets placed on the agenda every round.
Yeah. Probably should have talked about that too, but okay. Anyway, speaking of Doom, let's talk about Ancient Evils.
Yeah, let's do it.
It's a card.
It's a card. I'm actually I have maybe an unorthodox opinion about Ancient Evils. Because some people are like, you always ward Ancient Evils, and some people are like, thank God I drew Ancient Evils, nothing happened to me this Mythos phase, right? I actually think that there are cases for both, because yes, there are times when you're like, if I'm in 4-player, this does equal 12 actions that we're losing, and there are also times where it's like, there are worse cards in this encounter deck that could kill me right now and end the scenario, whereas it'll lop a turn off at the end when maybe we don't even get there. I think that Ancient Evils, in that sense, is just very well designed because it adds pressure without adding pressure, if that makes any sense. It's
Right.
like this virtual pressure that it adds. And I think that in that sense, it's very, very cool.
Right. And in this particular scenario, I mean, the causing the agenda to advance is not that big of a deal. I don't think there's a couple of like you discard cards or something when.
Yeah. And then on the second one, you'd like maybe spawn an enemy. I think actually you do spawn an enemy.
You do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's not that tough, but it does sort of alert you to sometimes you cannot count the number of rounds that are left. And
Correct.
I think that's an important lesson that Ancient Evils is always going to teach you. So you can't necessarily count on what's going to happen as far as how many actions you have left. But in this particular scenario, I think it's fine. As we'll see, when it gets really thorny is when other cards add Doom in play, and then you really might not be able to count on anything. But that's not going to happen in the scenario except for your own player cards and just the thing we talked about with the ghouls at the end of the scenario. So in this version of the Gathering, I don't think that 10 Doom matters so much unless you really, really are struggling. But
yeah, I agree.
In the Return to, which we'll just touch on a little bit later, this can start to add up a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, other iconic sets. These are, again, all of these except for the Flesh Eater and the Icy Ghoul are going to reoccur in basically every campaign.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about Chilling Cold?
Yep.
Yeah. So this one has, honestly, this encounter set is so unique in the sense that it has some of the easiest cards in the game and the most difficult cards in the game.
Mm-hmm.
Crypt Chill can be utterly devastating at some points, especially in the beginning of a scenario when maybe your whole turn you played one asset to get set up and then it gets knocked off during the Mythos phase. What this card teaches the players, I think, is that your assets, while they are very, very good, there is opportunity for them to become lost, and also to emphasize like, hey, willpower is a very, very important stat. You need to have a way to deal with it at some point.
That 4 though is really tough.
It's really tough. I kind of like, when balancing a scenario like this, I wonder how much that 4 in the Crypt Chill came about during playtesting, because I can imagine maybe it started as a 3, but I don't know. Maybe Agnes got hit with a Crypt Chill and they're like, oh, it's totally fine. And then Agnes got hit with another Crypt Chill and she failed, but she was like, okay, I'll just discard this empty shriveling or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
This card has a lot of variance, I guess. Depending on who it hits, it can be fine or it could be very, very bad.
Yeah, it's funny because I think with Agnes, you are happy to see this, even though it is a willpower test that's relatively high. You're more likely to run out of charges on something or discard your Arcane Initiate and even use it during the test, right?
Yep.
So it's interesting. But if you're Roland and you lose your only weapon out there, and that you
Yeah.
spent 4 resources for,
Or you're
you're in for a
skids
bad
and you
time.
lose Leo DeLuca.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Have you ever taken the damage on this card?
I have never taken the damage on this card.
Yeah, me neither.
I'm sure that was put in there. Well, I'm because obviously it maybe needs to do something, but yeah, it's a very rare circle. I've never played an investigator that didn't have assets out in the table at one. Well, that's not true, but yeah, very rare occurrence.
Yeah. Okay, Obscuring Fog, as you mentioned, is pretty soft.
Yeah, I think it's relatively soft. Again, there's a lot of variance with this card because you put it on the attic and you're like, this is fine. You put it on the cellar and you're like, I guess we're not getting the clues off the cellar.
Mm-hmm.
Which is certainly saying something. I think that it's one of those things where the reason that this card is relatively soft is because generally Seekers have a solution to this card, which is they can commit a lot of book to a single test. Generally, a lot of the good Seeker cards have book icons on them. So all this really requires is just some resources spent from a Seeker. And then the card is solved for everyone.
Of course, you also can draw this where there are no clues.
Yes, and that's another key thing. Is like you are either the location has no clues, or you have already discovered all the clues, or there's already an Obscuring Fog there. That can also happen too. And because there's limit 1 per location, you literally just don't get an encounter card for that Mythos phase.
That's another one of those. Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, there's like one scenario where this can get pretty bad, but most of the times it's completely solvable and or not a problem. Like you're totally happy to have drawn nothing.
So this is the only Shroud location that's above 2.
In this scenario, correct.
Wow, that's wild. Okay.
Yeah. It's yeah.
All right. Anyway, so that's Chilling Cold, and it also appears basically everywhere.
Yep.
It's a good set. I mean, you have to pay attention to it. These are both hazards, which can come into play later, although you're probably you probably let Obscuring Fog do its thing most of the time, but Crypt Chill can be... Actually, there's a fair number of hazards here, right? Grasping Hands is also a hazard.
Correct.
So if you're replaying this with Edge of the Earth cards, just put on your protective gear that you have somehow within the thick of it.
Within the thick of it, exactly.
Okay. Last encounter set is the Swarm of Rats.
Yeah, Swarm of Rats is a very well designed card in the sense that it is. I believe Justin from Play Board Games has said this a lot. It's an action tax for the fighter, because it's literally just, can you hit a 1 health enemy? It's a very nice. What it allows is it allows the encounter deck to hold the right distribution of enemies. Because Swarm of Rats against the Seeker, Daisy in particular, she could technically deal with this with her 2 combat, getting a skull or a -1. And so it's possible, right? And so what this is just, can you take a fight action to deal with this? Because it is not a nothing burger. Like 1 damage, especially if you take a tax opportunity, can add up, especially for someone like Daisy or Agnes. And so what it just does is it means that it fleshes out the encounter deck so that it smooths out the ratio between treacheries and enemies. Because you don't want so little enemies that all you're getting is treacheries, and then it doesn't feel like there's anything going on the board.
There's usually about 30%, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, but that's roughly what the designers seem to have come up with for the scenarios. And it's an interesting one also because if you're playing a non-conventional fighter like Agnes or something, the way that you deal with this is probably not by taking a fight test, right? I mean, you could, but you might be able to able to take a horror on command somehow, or maybe from an encounter card, and deal with the rats with their 1 health that way. So it's nice to have a 1 health enemy on the board that can be solved with a few different tricks.
I think it also leans into some interesting decision points for investigators that can deal 2 damage reliably. For example, Roland with his machete or 45 automatic, or Agnes with her shriveling, because it becomes an interesting discussion on, do I waste a bullet on this? Because you could just hit it and you're rolling with 4 to 1, but of course there is a -4 in the bag on standard.
Hmm.
So it becomes an interesting decision point where it's not as easy as just, oh, it's a 2 health ghoul, I'm just going to shoot it.
That's right. Yeah, that is true. So I think what Roland, if he gets up to 5 combat with a beat cop in play, is totally fine to, well, everything but 1 token to try to punch one of these rats if it's engaged with someone else.
Yeah.
But otherwise, the guard dog could maybe do the trick if you engage it and walk away. It's a fun enemy. Now it has 3 agility, which I don't think I've ever tried to evade these guys. You don't really want to do it, right? They have hunter.
They do.
Yeah, just get rid of them.
Yeah.
They also show up in a lot of campaigns, in a couple of campaigns in fairly unique ways, which we will get to at some point. But
they're like the ghouls. They kind of get remixed in those campaigns.
Okay, I think that is it for kind of our in-game discussion here. Let's just maybe run through our, unless there's anything else that I've forgotten.
No, I think you got it all.
Okay, so let's just run through quickly our metrics and talk about how we might rate this scenario, again, given what it is. So what do you think? Does this have any sort of replayability for you, given that you probably have played it a number of times with new players? Yeah.
Yeah, I think on a replayability, I'd probably put it like at a fairly low down, like a 1.5-ish, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Because there is the element of whether or not you get the Ghoul Priest or you resign, and there is the choice on whether or not to burn your house down or not. Again, they're not very impactful, but I do think that what it has in replayability is the fact that it's a scenario where the outcome, like the perfect win of killing the Ghoul Priest, especially at the beginning, isn't as certain as maybe it could be later on in your career in playing this game. And so there is an element of like, oh, we had to run last time, so now I want to come back and actually try and kill the Ghoul Priest.
Yeah, there's someone who has played, I think, solo every single investigator and has like a YouTube channel that just plays The Gathering over and over again.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine doing that, but I do see how like every investigator might tackle this a little bit differently, which is good. Yeah, I mean, I'm probably gonna land where you are too. It's, there's not much to look forward to as far as surprises or the way certain cards might come out in a different way affecting things. So it's okay, right?
Yeah.
But it's doesn't live up to the heights of the future scenarios we're going to talk about.
Yes.
All right, let's go to the next one, which is, we'll talk about fairness.
Yeah, so I think that we've already discussed the fairness of the scenario is predicated on the fact that it is a tutorial scenario. And so already there are loads of interesting and meaningful decisions for the players. Obviously, it's not like there's a huge breadth of decisions because it's a fairly on-rail scenario. You do this, you go to the thing, and then you get out. And so there isn't too much of the sort of branchingness going on. But I think that for me, the fairness is going to land pretty much in the middle, like a 2.5. As it is basically, it gives the players all the tools they need, while not necessarily adding too much pressure in like an enjoyable sense. I think that for a blind playthrough, this would definitely be higher for me, as honestly like even a 4 or a 4.5. But I think, as overall, I think it's kind of in the middle for me.
All right. I'm now realizing the scale is, so you're 2.5 out of 5. I guess that's kind of right where it is. I'm trying to figure out where those notches are supposed to be. So maybe the one, I could go back and change. You said 1.5 for the first one. All right, I'll pick it up next time. These aren't supposed to be like, official set in stone ratings or anything.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, right in the middle, 2.5. Yeah, the way I look at it is pretty similarly. I think that, again, your first time you play through, you're going to be, you might be really scared of the Ghoul Priest. but I think every time I played this with new players, we've done very well.
Hmm.
I think the only times I've had to go resign was, some, awful tokens that got pulled at the end there. So, um, yeah, I'm going to land at probably a little bit higher because I do find most of what happens when it's the first time you play to be um, really interesting and does, as long as you kind of know the rules, that might be a little bit harder.
Yeah.
You have a lot of different things you can do. So I'll go with a 3.
Cool.
All right, balance. Now I think we can just talk about maybe the core set investigators for this. Can you do this scenario with all 5 of them? I don't even know if like you're supposed to solo. Like, what does Daisy do in this scenario? I don't know. Once you get to the Ghoul Priest and it spawns on you, you have to figure out how to evade somehow. Maybe with hyper awareness or mind over matter.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like if you don't have someone like Roland or Aglinus that can deal consistent damage, the outcome is that you run.
Yeah.
Um, I think that, and honestly, it's interesting because I think that's honestly a lot of players' experience with this scenario starting out is that they run anyway
Mm.
because the Ghoul Priest does seem insurmountable, especially if you've already used a lot of resources like bullets or beat cops to deal with the other enemies. Um, so for me, in terms of balance, I think that especially with the core set, there's a variety of play styles that this scenario caters to because of how basic it is. The first 2 acts are just get clues and deal with enemies, which is sort of the staple of every single scenario and every challenge that the players will ever need to deal with. And
Hmm.
so, as long as your investigator can do something to that effect, then I think you'll succeed. That third act, as you were talking about, is where the balance can be a little bit tough because you either need someone who can deal a lot of damage or you need someone that has a high intellect value to be able to parlay Leaders Chandler. And for someone like a Mystic, they may be able to deal a lot of damage with maybe Shriveling, but they're not going to have a lot of success getting Leaders Chandler.
Yeah, it's a 4 intellect test.
Yes.
That's tough.
Um, it's literally like Daisy, this is your job. Um,
And maybe Wendy can pull it off with a lucky or something.
That's true, as well as discarding cards to her ability.
Hmm.
Um, it's definitely possible. So for me, I think balance will come down to a 3, um, which I'm now realizing you're right on where my numbers are screwed up, but exactly there. Um, I think that the first 2 acts present basically anyone can do anything, and then the last act is a bit tough, and so that knocks it down a little bit.
Yeah, and it's okay for it to be tough at the end. As we talked about with the resolutions,
Yeah.
there's a couple things that can happen, and that's what the scenario is trying to teach you as well. So yeah, um, yeah, I don't think it comes down hard on any particular investigator. And I also want to point out that I'm going to probably rate it actually even a little higher at 3.5 or
Hmm.
4.5, whatever this is. Um, no, this is a 4. Um, because of the encounter deck. I think the encounter deck is brilliant in that it doesn't just focus on one stat. You can get really messed up with, say, Daisy pulling uh, the grasping hands a few times. So as much as we talk about Roland, oh no, he's frail. He has 3 willpower. He only has 5 sanity, right? But he
Yep.
can sort of pass that test. It's a degree of difficulty test anyway. But
Hmm.
Daisy can pull grasping hands and die just as easily, even maybe more so with only 2 agility. So I do think it's a pretty well balanced encounter deck, and that allows for a little bit more for the investigators to pay attention to. Now, I think it's better in 3 or 4 player because of that, but that's just the nature of the game, I think.
Yes.
All right, let's go on to the last one, which is the experience. This is hard to talk about, right? Because it's the first one. So,
I mean, I will say if it presents a new and interesting gameplay loop, absolutely. This is the first scenario, and this game is presenting a very interesting gameplay loop by being the first one.
mhm.
Um,
Even
and so
so,
to that,
the
go
yeah,
ahead,
even
please.
so, like the Ghoul Priest and going to Parlay, I'm trying to think, is there any other scenario that does something like that?
I don't know. Yeah, like at times when a big enemy shows up nowadays, it's either like near the end of a campaign or you're not really meant to kill that enemy, especially in the first few scenarios.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, so I think that in terms of like the final act where the very interesting decision points of do we go get Lita, do we just resign, is a really cool feeling on the stress of the scenario. Um, there's this Spotify account, or actually I think they're also a YouTube channel that has music that accompanies every scenario that you can play. And the third act of this first scenario was very memorable for me because it felt very stressful, and we felt like, oh my god, we're not going to be able to do it. Just because on like the meat that comes out of the act deck when the Ghoul Priest shows up is a very spooky encounter. At the
You
same
know,
time, I think that it adds to the fiction that it is trying to evoke. You're stuck in your house, and you're feeling like scratches coming down from under the floor, and I think that it kind of like culminates in this like awesome moment. So,
I think you've
um,
convinced me. I'm putting this at the top. I think it does a great job of all those things you just talked about.
yeah, I'll join you at the top.
All right.
Um, I think that like for a first scenario, the real success of the scenario is that it really evokes that like small horror feeling. You're like in a very tight space and you're trying to get out.
And if you happen to have left all the ghouls in play and they're crawling their way to where the ghoul priest is, that's pretty cool. Like
Yeah.
this is a well designed scenario as far as the theme goes.
Mhm.
I'm with you there. Okay, so let's just leave things at the leave things for the vanilla, and maybe just a few minutes about the return to, which turns this into a full scenario, I would say, with more rooms of your house, uh, some different encounter cards, but that's just the way things go in the return twos in general. We're not going to spend that much time, I think, with the return twos. I'm not going to look at every individual card.
Yeah.
But I've enjoyed replaying the Return to quite a bit. When I've gone through and want to revisit Night of the Zealot, when I just play myself or with some people who've already played, we definitely just play the Return to, and it's fun. I think it's interesting because it actually has a different theme to it. For the encounter cards, there's a little bit more of willpower and hand discard, which is not really present in the original set as much. I think it's just there on the one of the act or agenda flips.
Mhm.
So it's actually a little bit tougher. I've doomed out before because there are more ghouls and they're a little bit harder to deal with.
Yeah, I think that the return to for this scenario succeeds in in what you said and in making it somewhat of a real scenario. Um, I really like the flavor of the new rooms of your house. I believe it's the bedroom and
Hmm.
your bathroom. Is that
Hmm.
correct?
Yep.
Um, and also the new enemies that spawn also in the bedroom and or the bathroom. Because they're more ghouls, but they're like a little bit spookier.
Hmm.
Um, I also really like the flavor of how you get to your hallway. So it feels very much more like a show versus tell because in in this the vanilla scenario it is very much like the act tells you, okay, you look down a hole and you're just in your hallway now, and like what the heck happened. But
Hmm.
in the return to, you go to the location which is I believe it's called Hole in the Wall, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
um and you go into it and you're like, you're in your hallway now. So it's a very interesting way to show the transition into the weirdness of your house as it's being transformed, in a really cool gameplay way.
And it still keeps all of the good stuff that we talked about with the encounter with the Ghoul Priest and Lita Chandler still there. So it really just fleshes out a little bit more of the rest of the scenario instead of kind of turboing you from the first act to kind of the end.
Yep.
And there's also, I think, a few more rooms in the attic or a different version potentially. So there's some
Correct.
replayability. You could get the victory point location, or you might get the I forget what it's called. It's like above your
Yeah,
house or something.
yeah. It's either you get the base version, which has the two precludes and the victory, or you get a location that has one precludes and also spawns another puts into play another location that has the victory, but only one precludes.
That's right.
And honestly, I will say the theming on the one that is the one that's the new attic where it goes above your house and you're like actually underground is just like classic, like what the heck is going on. It's really cool.
Mm-hmm. All right. That's, I think, it for us today. This is maybe a little bit longer than normal, or maybe not.
Yeah.
We'll see. Because we wanted to really talk about these things for the first time and talk about the encounter cards and how they fit in. But when we see Rotting Remains again, we're not going to remark on it other than how it interacts with other cards in the set. All right. Anything you'd like to add to close us out?
I think that we're all good.
Okay.
Talked a lot about the scenario, more than
Yeah.
I thought we would.
I know there's actually something to say about this one. And
Yeah.
if you've played this campaign, or sorry, this game quite a bit and you haven't revisited The Gathering, it's maybe worth just looking at the cards again, playing it through just to see what it's like with maybe investigators that you haven't played it with. And I remember playing this with Monterey Jack not so long ago when Edge of the Earth investigators had just come out, and I felt like I learned something about the investigator by moving around quite a bit. It was kind of fun. So even just the fact that this holds up with all the new cards and new investigators is a win, I think, for the design team.
Yeah.
All right, great. We will see you in the next video, which will be about the Midnight Masks, which we will say many good things about as well, and probably a lot to say because it is another one of these classic scenarios with new encounter cards that show up again and again. All right, until then, see you later.
Bye bye.